Well, hello. So glad we get the opportunity to continue our study of the prayers of the Old Testament, looking at how the Hebrew Scriptures give us great examples of what prayer is all about, how we should be praying, what the objectives of prayer should be. Today I want to take a look at a really moving prayer out of the book of Ezra. Now, Ezra and Nehemiah, which is kind of essentially two halves of the same book, is a really interesting text because it's post-exilic, and so it's written after all of the horrible things that happen in the book of Kings and the book of Chronicles, where Israel and Judah have fallen to foreign invaders because of their sin. And so there's naturally a more reflective aspect to this, because the people who have survived this and have now, lived these decades in captivity in Babylon and then Persia, they naturally have reflected upon what has occurred, why it has happened, and they're very keenly aware of their sin before the Lord. And so what I want to take a look over the next couple of videos is the prayers of Ezra and Nehemiah, because they're really interesting in a particular element, and that's the idea of a corporate mentality towards sin. Now, what I mean by that is a lot of times when we think of sin, we tend to, I think, kind of reflect an American cultural idea of individualism. And so when you think about just America in general, we have a culture and even a constitution that prizes individualism, that prizes the idea of taking responsibility for yourself, taking responsibility for your own actions. And all of that certainly is good and can be a biblical way of thinking. But there's another element, I think, to sin, and that's the idea of corporate guilt, the idea that our sin impacts more than just us. And we are even participants in some sins in a corporate sense. And I think you're going to see what I mean as we read the book of Ezra. Now, remember who Ezra is. Ezra is a scribe. He's kind of coming in the second half of this book. The first half of Ezra talks about Zerubbabel leading the Israelite people back to the land to rebuild the temple. You then have a gap of a couple more decades, and then Ezra is going to return, and he's going to be leading people to restore Israelite customs and practices using the law. All the people who have returned, they've built the temple, but there's still kind of a gap in knowledge with this new generation. And so Ezra is a scribe. The evidence also indicates he's a priest as well. So Ezra is no slouch. Ezra is a righteous man. He's a holy man. And remember, he also is decades, if not a century at this point, after the fall of Judah. So he's not even alive when Judah is taken away for their sins. And yet, notice what's going to happen in Ezra chapter 9. Now, when we went through the book of Ezra, we talked about this, that there's some kind of questions about whether Ezra's response to this issue is the best one, is the right one. That's not really what I'm concerned about with this prayer. What I am concerned about is noting the confession that Ezra is going to give. And so let's go ahead and dive into Ezra 9, and I think you'll see what we're talking about here. It says in Ezra 9 and verse 1, "Now when these things had been completed, the princes approached me, saying, the people of Israel and the priests and the Levites have not separated themselves from the peoples of the lands, according to their abominations. Those are the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites, the Ammonites, the Moabites, the Egyptians, and the Amorites. For they have taken some of their daughters as wives for themselves and for their sons, so that the holy race has intermingled with the peoples of the land. Indeed, the hands of the princes and the rulers have been foremost in this unfaithfulness. When I heard about this matter, I tore my garment and my robe and pulled some of the hair from my head and my beard and sat down appalled. Then everyone who trembled at the words of the God of Israel on account of the unfaithfulness of the exiles gathered to me, and I sat appalled until the evening offering. But at the evening offering, I arose from my humiliation, even with my garment and my robe torn, and I fell on my knees and stretched out my hands to the Lord my God." So Ezra hears of an issue that's going on in the exilic community, and that there's been intermarriage. Again, there's debate about how much of an issue this really is, what is the problem here, but regardless of what it is, Ezra clearly feels guilt over it. But Ezra hasn't done this. Ezra has not been a part of this sin. He hasn't been a part of the sin that led to exile. And so Ezra is innocent in this manner. And yet, look at what he prays right here in verse 6. It reads, "I said, O my God, I am ashamed and embarrassed to lift up my face to thee, my God, For our iniquities have risen above our heads, and our guilt has grown even to the heavens. Since the days of our fathers to this day, we have been in great guilt. And on account of our iniquities, we, our kings and our priests, have been given into the hand of the kings of the lands, to the sword, to captivity, and to plunder, and to open shame, as it is this day. But now, for a brief moment, grace has been shown from the Lord our God to leave us an escaped remnant, to give us a peg in his holy place, that our God may enlighten our eyes and grant us a little reviving in our bondage. For we are slaves. Yet in our bondage, our God has not forsaken us, but has extended loving kindness to us in the sight of the kings of Persia, to give us reviving, to raise up the house of our God, to restore its ruins, and to give us a wall in Judah and Jerusalem. And now, our God, what shall we say after this? For we have forsaken thy commandments, which thou hast commanded by thy servant the prophets, saying, the land which you are entering to possess is an unclean land, with the uncleanness of the peoples of the land, with their abominations which have filled it from end to end, and with their impurity. So now do not give your daughters to their sons, nor take their daughters to your sons. And never seek their peace or their prosperity, that you may be strong and eat the good things of the land, and leave it as an inheritance to your sons forever. And after all that has come upon us for our evil deeds and our great guilt, since thou, our God, hast requited us less than our iniquities deserve, and hast given us an escaped remnant as this, shall we again break thy commandments and intermarry with the peoples who commit these abominations? Wouldst thou not be angry with us to the point of destruction, until there is no remnant nor any who escape? O Lord God of Israel, thou art righteous, for we have been left an escaped remnant. As it is this day, behold, we are before thee in our guilt, for no one can stand before thee because of this. Ezra prays this prayer, and do you notice how many times he uses corporate terminology? This is a prayer of confession, but it's not a prayer of confession for Ezra's sins. Ezra hasn't done this. Ezra has not taken a wife of the native peoples of the land, which is the issue that they're concerned about. He hasn't done this. He hasn't been one of the ones that sinned leading to exile. He's born after the exile. So why is Ezra praying this prayer? And I think sometimes if we approach this from an individualistic mentality, when we talk about national sin, when we talk about corporate sin, about things that large groups are a part of, a lot of time we define it as, well, I'm not guilty of that. I didn't do that thing. Why should I be held accountable for this thing that I did? And certainly there's a biblical principle there. The Bible talks about that sons shall not be held guilty for the sins of their fathers. And that's a principle. But we're also seeing a different principle at play here. And Ezra is not saying this because he thinks I'm going to face divine judgment myself because somebody else did something for me or because my father did something for me. That's not the point of this. But what is the point is that there have been consequences for the sins of a corporate element. And to a degree, Ezra perceives that he has been affected by that sins. He has been affected by the ramifications of those sins. And so Ezra, in identifying himself with this group of corporate Israel, he feels himself to be a part of this community. And as part of that community, he is offering up a prayer on behalf of the community that they all may be forgiven of this sin, even if as individuals they didn't participate in that. I think this is a really radical way of looking at prayer because, again, it's very countercultural to what we think of. I mean, if you just think, not to get political, but you just think of like any political issue that involves something in the past. So quick, we're just saying, well, like, oh, I wasn't involved in that. I didn't, participate in that corrupt economic practice. I didn't, do that to those previous peoples. Why should I have to be worried about this? And again, there's kind of a biblical element of that, but there's also a biblical reality that we have a participation in a community. We are part of a group of people. And I think there's something to be said for reconciling and recognizing the things that us as communities have partaken in. And so, again, this is probably one of the more controversial ideas that I think we're going to present in this series. But I think as Christians, we should recognize that we can ask forgiveness for things we haven't done. And it's a biblical principle. And again, we're going to reinforce this because there's multiple other prayers. This is not a one-off incident. We're going to see Nehemiah is going to twice offer a prayer about this. We're going to see Daniel is going to offer a prayer like this, again, where they themselves have done nothing wrong, and yet they feel compelled to ask for forgiveness and reconcile with national sins outside of their own doing. And so I think if we're seeing something repeated multiple times in Scripture, we should recognize that. And we should ask, what is our responsibility in that type of situation? So what I want to do with this video is really just kind of introduce this concept of the idea of corporate sin and the idea of corporate forgiveness. And so we're going to look more at this as we continue with the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, because again, we're going to see two really strong prayers in the book of Nehemiah that are going to follow this same principle. And again, both those books are kind of working together to discuss this. We're going to continue talking about this in the next couple of videos, but I encourage you to think on this. This may be something that you've never really wrestled with. This is something that's kind of new for me over the past couple of years, the idea of corporate guilt, because again, it's something that we don't necessarily talk a lot about as, individuals and as a society that prioritizes individualism. So I want to introduce that concept, and I hope that that gives you some things to think about. Read through this type of prayer. Think about what corporate things have we been a part of. Again, something that we may not have done anything wrong ourselves, but are there historical issues? Are there things that have happened within our town, our state, our nation, our community, our people groups that we may be still facing the ramifications of today? So that's what we're going to kind of look at as we go through the next couple of videos, is thinking about this idea of being a member of a community and being sensitive to those issues that have affected our community. Thank you so much for tuning into this. I know it's a little bit of a different video than what we might think, but I think this is such an important concept that we really do grasp from the Old Testament, the idea of not just our individual relationship with God, but our corporate, our community relationship with God. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope this has been an edifying video for you. I hope you stick around for a couple more videos as we continue to discuss these things over the next couple of weeks. Thank you so much. We'll see you again next time.